What I want to talk to do today is it's relevant to the question that was just asked about the downstream users. A little bit about me first is I'm a chemist by training, so my initial part of my career I spent doing environmental and analytical chemistry, and now I've moved into the product chemistry side, but on the front end trying to basically prevent the problems that I spent the first part of my career trying to clean up. So I've kind of moved to the front end of things. CNA is a retailer. I'm with CNA Europe. It's been around for about 170 years, so it's a well-established private company here in Europe. We also have CNA in Brazil, in Mexico, and in China as well. So we're a global company. And CNA has been a leader in the past in some of the social areas and also in terms of some of the move towards organic cotton. I just joined CNA about 8 weeks ago, so I'm new to the company, but not new to this topic. I've been working in this field of chemicals related to the textile industry for about 10 years. So what I hope to do today is just kind of walk you through some of the thinking that we have at CNA on this, and also some of the industry-wide thinking and some of the work that's going on around chemicals and products specifically related to textiles and also footwear. So one thing is the textile industry is a very old industry. The techniques in a lot of places haven't changed for 200 years. They're using the same basic process, the same chemicals. You could go and dye something this way today, just manually, but again, it's not optimized for the 21st century, but nonetheless, you can still produce a product that way, but we need to move ahead. We need to move to things where we're using things like supercritical fluid dyeing, so this would be a waterless dyeing process that is Daiku machines and Nike and others have invested in this to bring the technology along. Another area is cotton. So, cotton is a very land-intensive crop. It takes a lot of water, but it also takes a lot of pesticides to produce the cotton. At CNA, thought about this, moved to biocotton. We're actually the number 2 user of biocotton globally, or organic cotton is what we refer to it in the U.S. So you can change the way that you think about how you're producing the product as well. You can come up with a new technology, or you can completely rethink, let's get away from regular cotton, let's move to biocotton. Those are a couple of examples, but all these examples, the textile industry uses hundreds of different processes and uses thousands of chemicals. And the difficulty is, at the end of the day, we have to produce a product that somebody sells, because if they're not buying the product, then that also becomes an issue, because now we've generated waste if it just sits on the shelf or has to be disposed of. So when I think about a product that we're producing, everybody thinks of, and they look at a t-shirt and they say, this is a really simple product. It's, it protects me from the elements, it has a certain color I want, and it has a certain feel I want. So it is simple in that respect, but actually the chemistry that goes into making a t-shirt is actually very complex. Whether it's a cotton shirt that you're dyeing, or whether it's a polyester shirt, there's a number of chemical steps that go into actually producing the color, putting some sort of a softener on there, and giving it the effects that a consumer will actually make them want to buy that shirt. So even though it looks simple, there's a lot of chemistry that goes on behind it. And if I were to put up here the synthesis of something like aspirin and compare that to how all the number of steps you would have to go through to get this green t-shirt, there'd be many more steps to get to the t-shirt than there would be to aspirin. Yet aspirin is a very regulated area. It's, you think about pharmaceutical grade chemicals, so that's very regulated, a higher value product in that terms compared to a t-shirt where it's perceived to have a simple function and therefore should be simple to produce. The history of the textile industry is that it's really driven by performance, and performance could be the way it feels or the way it looks, but also price. It is definitely price driven. And my example here is, I would call this color mauve. There might be some fashion designers in our company that would disagree with what color it is, but that's on my example, this is mauve. And back in about 1850, Perkin actually isolated this from what was a waste product. They were trying to figure out what to do with the waste from coal gasification, and people were working at it, and they isolated they figured out they could get dyes from this. And so he isolated this, and he took it to the dyers at the time they were in Scotland, and he said, I have this great dye. Nobody else can make a color that's this vivid. Nobody else can make it stick to the fabric as well as I do. And the comment that came back to him was, well, this is great. We love it. Is it going to make the product cost anymore? And I can tell you that I've heard that many, many times in my career. Is the first time you suggest that you have something better, the first thing they want to know is the price. So it not only has to perform, but you have to think about the price. Now, the other side of this is if you can make it perform so well that people can get over that. In this case, it became a very fashionable color. And all of a sudden, people didn't care that it cost a little bit more, or the perceived cost was more. Everybody wanted to use that color. So if you can make something that has a better function, but make it more sustainably, that will drive this work too. So that's an example. That launched basically the synthetic organic chemistry field. But as an example of how long it can take for substitutions to occur without any driving force, all the way back in 1782, France called for a substitute pigment for lead white. So lead was traditionally used as the lead carbonate to get this white color, which I've represented in the middle here. So 1782, they put out a call. They said, we know it's toxic. We need a replacement. Somebody came up with the idea that they could use zinc. So they used a zinc oxide as a replacement. Unfortunately, it didn't cover as well, so it had poor performance. It was more expensive. And by about 1834, there were some applications that used it, but there were still people that were publishing saying you should never use the replacement because it's a really bad performer. So you fast forward all the way to 1921, and finally there's some legislation against lead in paint in multiple countries, and somebody discovers that they can use titanium dioxide as a white pigment. And they can produce it not only to have better quality than the previous lead pigments, but they can produce it cheaper. But it took a number of rounds of innovation and people thinking about the problem and being asked by the downstream users, why aren't you using this? Why doesn't this substitute work for you, to get to the point where, unfortunately still at the end of the 20th century, we're dealing with lead in paint. But it's an example that I came across of how long it can take some of these things to be pushed into the supply chain. Unfortunately, we need to speed this up. This is far too long to take to replace something. But it underscores the importance of when people are coming up with substitutes, they need to think about how it performs to the downstream users. And if they can make it perform better, people will use that regardless of whether it's whether it's a better alternative. You don't have to convince them to switch their chemistry if it has a better performance. That's the ultimate selling point you can have in a company, is that this is a better product and will ultimately give the consumer a better product. So what are we doing industry-wide in this area? The point was mentioned about downstream users and are we pushing. So about 3 years ago, 6 brands came together, of which CNA was one of the founders, and formed what's called the ZDHC, or Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals Program. And the idea was that as brands individually, we have very little leverage over not only our suppliers, because they're contracted suppliers, but we have very little leverage over the chemical companies that supply our fabric mills and the dye houses. So the idea was that if we could all come together with one voice, ask the industry for different changes to make in the chemistry, that we would have more effect and be able to move things faster. We now have 18 brands. We actually took a look at the chemicals that we thought might be in use in the textile industry, and it depends on who you talk to, but there's probably about 10,000 dyes that could be out there to be used. They're probably not all in use at once, but there's 10,000. There's probably several thousand, 2,000 to 3,000, what we call auxiliary chemicals, so the things that make the dyes work, the soaps and the surfactants and things that go into making the chemicals work. And then there's probably 40 or 50 what you call basic chemicals, so acids and bases and that sort. So we're talking about 4,000 or 5,000 chemicals at least that could be in use in the textile industry. we took a list that was out there that was produced by Chemi in Sweden and also the University of Dortmund in Germany on textile chemicals, and we filtered that list. And one of the things we filtered against was the SIN list, because we felt that that was a way to quickly recognize where we would have problems. We filtered it against the SIN list, filtered out compounds that had already been restricted by each of the brands, and came up with one list which we call the Manufacturing Restricted Substances List. And that list is a list of chemicals that we do not want our supply chain to have and use in their factories. So it's not just the chemicals that would end up on the product, but it's also solvents that we don't want them to use that might go to the air. It's detergents that they may use that may be ending up in the wastewater, to send a signal that that's something we want them to move towards. In addition to that, there were several chemicals that we thought there's no good substitute for right now. There's no viable substitute that we can switch to easily, or it's a chemical that's used in so many places it needs more than one substitution. It's not just used in a single application. It's got multiple applications. So we came up with what we called the research list. And the idea is we want to send a signal to the chemical suppliers and universities that are working in this area that for the textile industry, these chemicals we would like to move away from. But we need people to go out and find substitutes for these chemicals. Now, some of these are maybe substitutes that people have proposed in the past. Maybe they didn't get taken up because of performance. Maybe it was price. Sometimes the price depends on, you can't always be the first one to buy it. It's usually more expensive, so there's that argument. But by and large, these chemicals are ones that are difficult right now to replace in our supply chain that we want to move away from. So we call this the research list, and we're in the process now of working through different partners that we have to get this information to the universities, to get it to the chemical companies so that they can begin to work on replacements and bring the solutions for these to our supply chain, bring them to us and our supply chain. And one thing that's important to know is that our suppliers don't know what these are. So if I go to my supplier and say, get rid of toluene, they may have no clue what I'm talking about. They know the formulation that they have, and that's what they're looking at. Yet as brands, we're faced with regulations, and I'm familiar with the U.S. because that's where I was working before, so the state of Washington and California, where you need to declare information about your product. We have chemical information on specific chemicals that we need. The suppliers know it as a formulation. The chemical suppliers know it as a chemical. So there's a gap in the middle, but we need to take this back to the chemical industry so that they can work on the formulations and then take that to our suppliers. So how do you drive this? How do you drive this? Basically, I think there's, the California green chemistry legislation certainly has made people aware of this. And I think green chemistry is a growing market. From a business standpoint, what you want to have is you want to have certainty about what's going to happen. It's a lot easier for me to make the case internally to my company that we need to put effort into replacing toluene in a certain application if I can point to something that's out there rather than just saying, I think it's a good thing, but I don't know where the legislation is going to be, because you have to still have the consistency and people have to know that it's not going to change over time. So I think that things like this can help send a signal both to the industry and also the downstream users that this is the way that things are going to go. What have we done at CNA proactively? So we're trying to stay ahead of this. We've banned, obviously, there's restricted substances that are legally required, but we've also banned PVC in our articles. We've banned bisphenol A for food contact or mouth contact products. And by January 1st, we'll have phased out of water repellency using fluorinated chemistries. And it's these type of things that, as an industry, we can do in this collaboration to try to move and send the signal that we're all going in the same direction. If CNA is the only one saying this, it makes it a difficult conversation with the supply chain. But if we can go there with 6 brands or 18 brands or 20 brands and send them the same signal, then not only convinces the supply chain that they do need to change, but it also convinces the chemical suppliers that there is a market there and there's a demand for their product.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.